The dust of Redemption Creek settled on everything, a fine red powder that coated the soul as surely as it did the boardwalks. For Jedediah Kane, the dust was a constant reminder of the life he had tried to bury. He had traded the cold steel of a Colt for the warm wood of a ranch house, the scent of gunpowder for the smell of hay and leather. For 5 years, he had almost convinced himself it was enough. He stood in the Redemption Savings and Trust, the air inside cool and still smelling of oiled wood and old paper. The teller, a young man named Peterson, with a nervous tick in his left eye, was counting out the coin for Jedediah's monthly supplies. Outside, the unforgiving sun bled across the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows from the saguaros that stood like silent sentinels on the edge of town. It was a peaceful afternoon, the kind Jedediah had learned to crave, the kind that always felt like a lie. The lie shattered with the explosion of glass. The bank's front window imploded, spraying jagged shards across the floor. Dust filled the air, thick and choking. 3 figures masked by dusty bandanas stormed through the splintered frame, their boots crunching on the debris. A 4th man stood guard at the door, a shotgun held steady in his hands. "Nobody move," the leader bellowed, his voice a gravelly rasp that cut through the sudden, terrified silence. Jedediah's body reacted before his mind did. Years of instinct honed in places far harsher than Redemption Creek took over. He dropped low, his hand instinctively going for the holster that was no longer there. His only weapon now was the hard-won peace he had cultivated, and it was useless against the barrels of the rifles swinging through the room. He shoved a woman and her small child behind the relative safety of a heavy oak desk, his movements fluid and economical. The robbers were efficient, their violence practiced. One vaulted over the counter, shoving Peterson against the wall. The metallic click of the safe's tumblers being forced echoed in the small space. The leader stalked the room, his eyes cold and dark, above the red cloth scanning the terrified patrons huddled on the floor. His gaze swept over Jedediah, pausing for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something that might have been recognition or merely appraisal. The lockbox, the leader growled at the robber behind the counter. "Number 17. Get it." Jedediah's blood ran cold. Lockbox 17 was his. It held the deed to his ranch, that the last tangible piece of his family's legacy. He had earned that land with sweat and blood, his own and others, and he would not see it stolen by common thieves. As the second robber fumbled with the keys, the leader's boot caught on a loose floorboard. He stumbled, cursing under his breath. A small object fell from his vest pocket, landing on the floor with a soft metallic clink. It slid under the desk where Jedediah was crouched. The robbery was over in moments. With the lockbox and a canvas bag of money in hand, the men backed out of the bank, their guns still trained on the frozen townspeople. The man at the door fired a single shotgun blast into the ceiling, raining plaster down on their heads. "A reminder to stay put," he snarled. Then they were gone, all their hoofbeats a fading drumbeat against the sudden deafening silence. For a long moment, no one moved. The child behind the desk began to cry, a thin, sharp wail that broke the spell. People stirred, gasping for air, their faces pale with shock. Jedediah remained where he was, his eyes fixed on the object that lay half-hidden in the shadows. He reached out his fingers, closing around cool, familiar silver. It was a locket. A woman's locket, tarnished with age, its surface etched with a delicate pattern of vines. His breath hitched in his throat. With a thumb that trembled slightly, he pressed the clasp. It sprang open. Inside, protected by a small, cracked piece of glass, was a faded portrait of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. His mother. It was her locket, the one his father had given her on their wedding day. The locket he had last seen around her neck on the night his world ended, the night raiders had swept down on their homestead, leaving nothing behind but fire death and a 10-year-old boy hiding in a storm cellar. He had always believed it was buried with her, lost forever in the ashes of his past. He stared at the tiny smiling face, and the carefully constructed piece of the last 5 years crumbled into dust. This wasn't a random robbery. The locket was a message, a ghost reaching out from a shallow grave. The past he had ridden so far to escape had just kicked down his door guns blazing. The quiet life of Jedediah Kane was over. The gunslinger he had tried to kill was stirring from his sleep, and vengeance he knew with a chilling certainty had finally found its way back to Redemption Creek. The ranch was Jedediah's sanctuary, a sprawling expanse of unforgiving land nestled in a valley that seemed to cup the silence of the desert. He had built the house himself from timber he'd hauled down from the distant mountains, its foundation sunk deep into the rocky soil. It was a fortress against the world and against the man he used to be. On the mantelpiece above the stone hearth hung a portrait of his father, a stern-faced man with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of hard-won victories. Jedediah had always seen him as a hero, a man who had carved a life from the wilderness through sheer force of will. Now that portrait felt like an accusation. He spent the 2 days after the robbery in a state of suspended animation and the silver locket, a cold, heavy weight in his pocket. The town sheriff, a world-weary man named Elias Thorne, had asked his questions. Jedediah had given him nothing. They were masked, he'd said, his voice flat, moved fast, took what they came for. Thorne had looked at him with tired eyes, knowing there was more, but also knowing better than to push Jedediah Kane. The true threat to Redemption Creek wasn't a band of bank robbers. It was a man named Silas Blackwood. Blackwood had arrived 6 months prior, with a fortune of unknown origin and an insatiable appetite for land. He was a man who moved in shadows, his wealth a weapon he wielded with chilling precision. Ranches bordering Jedediah's had been bought out for prices far below their worth, and their owners convinced by veiled threats, sudden misfortunes, and the unsettling presence of Blackwood's hired guns. Blackwood wanted the whole valley, and Jedediah's Double K Ranch was the stubborn heart of it. Jedediah had refused every offer, every polite but menacing visit from Blackwood's foreman. He knew men like Blackwood. They saw land not as a home, but as a territory to be conquered. And until the robbery, he'd believed it was just business. The locket changed everything. It made the fight personal. It tied Silas Blackwood not just to the land, but to the blood that had been spilled on it 15 years ago. On the third day, as the sun began its descent, casting long bruised shadows across the valley, Jedediah finally saddled his horse, Jericho. The locket was tucked safely inside his shirt, its coldness a constant reminder against his skin. He rode not toward town, but toward the ruins of his old family homestead, a place he hadn't visited since the day he'd buried his parents. The ride was a pilgrimage through a landscape of ghosts. Every rock formation, every twisted juniper tree whispered a memory. He saw his mother, her apron dusted with flour, calling him in for supper. He saw his father teaching him how to track a deer, his voice a low, steady rumble of patience and strength. The man in the portrait. The hero. The homestead was little more than a scar on the land. The blackened timbers of the house lay in a collapsed heap, slowly being reclaimed by sagebrush and desert weeds. The only thing still standing was the stone chimney, a lonely monument to a life turned to ash. He dismounted Jericho, snorting softly behind him, and walked to the 2 simple wooden crosses that marked the graves. He had made them himself a boy of 10 with a stolen hatchet and a heart full of rage. He knelt, tracing the faded letters of his mother's name. "Someone knows," he whispered into the vast, indifferent silence. "Someone who was there that night is still here." The robbery, the lockbox, the locket, it was all connected, a tangled knot he had to unravel. His peaceful existence was a luxury he could no longer afford. He had to know who had orchestrated the death of his family and why. He pulled the locket from his shirt, its silver glinting in the dying light. The woman in the portrait smiled back, her painted eyes full of a love he could barely remember. The raiders had taken everything from him, but they had missed this. Or more chillingly, one of them had kept it. A trophy. A cold resolve settled over him, displacing the grief that had been his companion for so long. He was no longer just a rancher defending his land. He was a son seeking justice. He rose to his feet, the dust of the graves clinging to his knees. The sun had finally sunk below the horizon, and the desert was awash in the deep velvet purple of twilight. He put the locket away and mounted his horse. The time for hiding was over. The journey back to Redemption Creek was a descent into a past he had sworn to forget. But now he would have to face it no matter the cost. His investigation had begun. Jedediah returned to town with the first light of dawn and the chill of the desert night still clinging to his coat. Redemption Creek was a town built on secrets, its people accustomed to minding their own affairs. Fear was a currency more valuable than gold, and Silas Blackwood had a deep well of it to draw from. Jedediah knew that asking questions would be like trying to strike a match in a downpour. He started at the saloon, the Gold Nugget, a place that thrived on loose talk and cheap whiskey. The saloon keeper, a cynical man named Bartholomew, with a face like a crumpled map, polished a glass as Jedediah approached the bar. "Early for you, Kane," Bartholomew grunted, not looking up. "Looking for information." Jedediah set his voice low. He slid a silver dollar across the polished wood. "About the robbery." Bartholomew's eyes flickered to the coin, then back to Jedediah's face. He pushed the dollar back. "Some things are best left buried, Jedediah. You of all people should know that." The message was clear. Blackwood's influence reached even here. Jedediah moved through the town, speaking to the blacksmith, the stable master, the clerk at the general store. He was met with the same wall of fearful silence. Men would avert their gaze, women would hurry their children inside. They knew who was choking the life out of their town, but they were too afraid to speak the name aloud. It was a quiet suffocation, and Jedediah felt its grip tightening around him. His last stop was the sheriff's office. Elias Thorne sat behind his desk, a stack of paperwork before him that he wasn't even pretending to read. The office smelled of stale coffee and defeat. "They're scared, Elias," Jedediah said, standing before the desk. "And you're not." Thorne countered, his voice weary. "Blackwood owns this town, Jed. He's got men on his payroll who make those bank robbers look like choir boys. I'm one man with one deputy who's more afraid of his own shadow than he is of outlaws. Someone has to stand up to him." "Someone tried." Thorne said, his gaze dropping to a framed photograph on his desk of a woman and a young girl. "Good man, Jacob Miller. Owned the ranch south of yours. He wouldn't sell. A month later, his well was poisoned. His cattle died. He was ruined. Packed up and left with nothing. Blackwood bought the land for pennies on the dollar." Thorne looked up, his eyes pleading. "Leave it be, Jed. He'll break you." Jedediah's jaw tightened. He started this. As he left the sheriff's office, the frustration coiling in his gut, he saw her. She was exiting the Blackwood Land and Cattle Office, a pristine building that stood in stark contrast to the town's weathered facade. She was a newcomer, her clothes stylish, but practical, suggesting she was from back east. She moved with a confidence that was unusual in Redemption Creek, her head held high, her gaze direct. There was an immediate tension in the air, as their eyes met, a silent acknowledgement of the opposing forces they represented. She approached him, her steps measured. "You must be Jedediah Kane," she said. Her voice was intelligent with a clarity that cut through the dusty air. "My name is Elena. I work for Mr. Blackwood." "I know who you work for," Jedediah replied, his tone clipped. The name Blackwood left a bitter taste in his mouth. "Mr. Blackwood is a businessman," she said, her expression unreadable. "He's made you a generous offer for your land. He believes in progress for this valley. I call it greed." A flicker of something annoyance, perhaps, or something deeper crossed her features. "I'm not looking for trouble, Mr. Kane, but I don't run from it either. I would advise you to reconsider his offer. It would be prudent." There was a warning in her words, but also a strange sense of detachment, as if she were reciting a script she didn't fully believe. Before Jedediah could respond, two of Blackwood's men emerged from the land office. They were large, rough-looking men, their holsters worn low on their hips, their eyes cold and empty. They flanked Elena, their presence a clear and deliberate act of intimidation. "Is there a problem here, Mr. Kane?" One of them asked, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. Jedediah's gaze didn't waver from Elena's. Not yet. He turned and walked away, the weight of their stares on his back. The meeting left him unsettled. Elena was not like Blackwood's other employees. There was a wariness in her eyes, a guarded intelligence that suggested she was more than just a secretary. She was a puzzle, and one he suspected was connected to the larger mystery he was trying to solve. That night, Blackwood's men came to his ranch. They didn't ride in shouting. They came in silence under the cover of a moonless sky. Jedediah was waiting for them. He'd seen the flicker of their lantern from a high ridge. He was in the barn, hidden in the hayloft, his father's old Winchester rifle resting in his hands. There were 3 of them. They carried torches, their intent clear. They meant to burn him out, just like Jacob Miller. As one of them threw open the barn door and another brought a torch forward, Jedediah fired. He didn't aim to kill. He shot the torch from the man's hand, sending it spinning into a water trough with a hiss. The men scattered, firing blindly into the darkness of the barn. Jedediah remained still, a ghost in the shadows. He fired again, shattering a lantern one of them had set on a fence post. Plunged into darkness, panicked and exposed, they scrambled for their horses and fled. He watched them go, the rifle cool and heavy in his grip. The attack was an escalation. Blackwood was done with polite offers. The time for intimidation was over. A war had been declared, and Jedediah knew with the grim certainty of a man who had fought wars before that it would only end in blood, his or Blackwood's. The failed attempt to burn his barn hardened Jedediah's resolve. Blackwood had shown his hand, and it was stained with the same violence that had shattered his childhood. He knew he couldn't fight this battle with his fists alone. He needed evidence, something to expose Blackwood for the predator he was. He began to dig into his own past, searching for a connection, a thread that would tie the present to the horrors of that night 15 years ago. He started in the small, dusty attic of his ranch house, a place filled with the ghosts of his family. He spent hours poring over his father's old belongings, journals, ledgers, and bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon. His father's handwriting was strong and clear, the writing of a confident man. The journals spoke of hardship and triumph, of droughts, cattle drives, and the slow, steady work of building a life from nothing. To Jedediah, they were scripture, the testament of a hero. But as he dug deeper, he found inconsistencies. An old ledger contained entries for land purchases that seemed unusually low, followed by cryptic notes about settling debts with families whose names he didn't recognize. He found a letter from a neighboring rancher dated a year before the raid, written in a shaky, angry script. It accused his father of a dishonest survey and a swindler's deal. At the time, Jedediah had dismissed it as the ramblings of a jealous man. Now it felt like a clue. His search for answers led him back to town, specifically to the county records office. The clerk, a man whose loyalty could be bought for a bottle of good whiskey, allowed him access to the archives. He spent a day surrounded by the musty smell of aging paper, tracing the history of land ownership in the valley. He found the original deed to his family's land, and next to it, the deed for the adjoining property, a massive tract of land that had once belonged to a family named Blackwood. According to the records, his father had acquired the Blackwood land after the family had defaulted on a loan. The signature on the transfer document, purportedly belonging to Elias Blackwood Sr., looked suspiciously different from other examples of the man's signature he found. It was a small detail, but it was enough. During his investigation, he crossed paths with Elena again. He found her one afternoon near the creek, sketching the landscape in a small notebook. Her guard was down, and for the first time, he saw a vulnerability in her that was absent from their previous encounters. "You're a long way from the office," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She closed her notebook, her composure returning like a mask. Even Mr. Blackwood's employees are allowed a moment of peace. "There's no peace in this valley anymore," he replied, stopping a few feet from her. "Not since he arrived." He saw a flicker of conflict in her eyes. "He's a complicated man," she said carefully. "He's been through a great deal. That doesn't give him the right to destroy the lives of others." A strange, reluctant alliance began to form between them. She seemed to be testing him, dropping small, indirect questions about his family, his history with the land. He in turn found himself watching her, trying to understand her loyalty to a man like Blackwood. He sensed she was trapped, her wariness a cage she couldn't escape. One evening she sought him out at the edge of town. There was a new urgency in her manner, a fear that she could no longer hide. "You need to be careful, Mr. Kane," she said, her voice a low whisper. "He knows you're digging into the past. He talks about old debts, about the sins of the father." "What does that mean?" Jedediah pressed. "I don't know," she admitted, her gaze darting nervously toward the shadows. "But when he says it, his eyes, they're full of a hatred so old it scares me. It's not about the land. Not just about the land. This is personal for him." She turned to leave, but Jedediah caught her arm. "Why are you telling me this?" Her eyes met his, and in their depths he saw a woman grappling with her own conscience. "Because I'm beginning to see that the man I work for is not the man I thought he was. He speaks of justice, but his methods are cruel. I came here to help him rebuild what his family lost. I didn't come here to be an accessory to ruin." With that, she pulled her arm free and disappeared into the twilight, leaving Jedediah with a new piece of the puzzle. Blackwood's animosity was personal. It was tied to a historic feud between their families, a feud that had apparently started with his father. The realization was a heavy blow. He returned to the ranch that night and took down the portrait from the mantel. He stared at the stern, painted face of his father, the man he had idolized his entire life. For the first time, he saw not a hero, but simply a man capable of the same greed and ambition as any other. The foundation of his world was cracking, and he feared what he would find in the chasm that was opening beneath his feet. The fight was no longer just about his land. It was about the truth of his own legacy. The truth, when it finally came, was a blow that struck Jedediah harder than any bullet. It arrived in a worn leather satchel delivered by a traveling preacher who had been a friend of his father's. The old man, hearing of the trouble brewing in Redemption Creek, had felt compelled to deliver a final confession. The satchel contained a letter written in his father's hand, addressed to Jedediah, to be opened only in the event of my untimely death. Jedediah sat at his kitchen table, the lantern casting a pool of golden light on the worn wood, and read the words that would dismantle his world. The letter was a confession. His father, William Kane, was no hero. He was a man driven by a desperate ambition to provide for his family. He had arrived in the valley with nothing and had seen the vast fertile lands owned by the Blackwood family. Using a combination of a forged signature on a loan document and a fraudulent land survey, he had systematically cheated Silas Blackwood's father out of his entire fortune. The Blackwood family, proud and once powerful, was ruined. They left the valley in disgrace, their name a synonym for failure. "I tell you this, not for forgiveness," his father wrote, "for I deserve none. I tell you so you understand that the world is not as simple as heroes and villains. I did what I did for you, for your mother. I built this ranch on a foundation of sin, and I fear that one day the debt will come due." The letter fell from Jedediah's hands. The raid, the fire, the death of his parents wasn't a random act of violence. It was retribution. Silas Blackwood wasn't some greedy land baron. He was a son seeking revenge for the destruction of his own family. The bank robbery hadn't been about money. It had been about retrieving the last remnants of his family's stolen legacy, the deed and the locket. His mother's locket. Jedediah suddenly understood with sickening clarity. The raiders who killed his family hadn't stolen the locket from his mother's body. The leader of the bank robbers, the man who dropped it, that man was Silas Blackwood. And the locket had never belonged to Jedediah's mother at all. It was a Blackwood family heirloom. His father must have taken it along with everything else and given it to his wife. A symbol of his conquest. The entire conflict was reframed. This wasn't a fight for land. It was a fight for redemption, a reckoning for the sins of his father. The ground beneath Jedediah's feet had vanished. He was the son of a thief living on stolen land, and the man he considered his enemy was the one with the rightful claim to justice. He sat in the silent house, the weight of his father's confession crushing him. The portrait on the floor seemed to mock him, its painted eyes holding a truth he had never been able to see. He felt a profound sense of shame and a bewildering empathy for the man who was trying to destroy him. How could he fight Silas Blackwood now? What right did he have to this land, to this life? His thoughts turned to Elena. Her words came back to him. I came here to help him rebuild what his family lost. He understood now. She wasn't just an employee. She was part of this legacy of ruin, trying to help her family reclaim what was stolen from them. Her internal conflict, her warnings to him, it all made sense. She was caught between her loyalty to her family and the dawning realization of the darkness driving the man she served. The revelation changed everything, but it didn't end the fight. It made the stakes infinitely higher. Blackwood's methods were brutal and unforgiving. He was becoming the very thing he sought to punish. Jedediah knew he couldn't simply walk away. The people of Redemption Creek were caught in the crossfire of this generational feud. His father had started this cycle of violence, and now it was up to him to end it. But he would no longer be fighting for his land or for revenge. He would be fighting for redemption, not just for himself, but for the memory of a father who was both a builder and a thief. The path forward was no longer clear, but he knew one thing for certain, and the final confrontation with Silas Blackwood was inevitable, and it would be a battle for the very soul of the valley. Silas Blackwood, now aware that his history was exposed, abandoned all pretense of civility. The polite threats and legal maneuvers were replaced by open warfare. He could no longer afford to let Jedediah live, not when Cain held the truth that could undermine his quest for vengeance and turn the town against him. Blackwood needed a villain, and he decided Jedediah would be cast in that role. The neighboring ranch, owned by an old-timer named Henderson, who had stubbornly refused to sell, became the stage for Blackwood's next move. One night a fire bloomed against the dark horizon, a hungry orange maw consuming Henderson's barn and home. By the time the flames died down, the ranch was a smoldering ruin. By morning, Blackwood's men were in town, spinning a tale of calculated malice. They claimed to have seen a lone rider fleeing the scene, a man matching Jedediah's description. They produced a witness, a drifter paid in whiskey and silver, who swore he'd heard Jedediah threatening Henderson just days before. Sheriff Thorne, cowed and outmanned, had no choice but to issue a warrant for Jedediah's arrest. The charge was arson and murder. Henderson's body had been found in the ashes. Jedediah became a wanted man overnight. The very town he had sought to protect now saw him as a monster. The fearful whispers that had followed him turned into open accusations. He was no longer just the reclusive rancher. He was Cain the killer. He was forced to abandon his ranch, to retreat into the harsh, unforgiving wilderness of the Badlands that bordered his property. A landscape of canyons and rock spires where a man could disappear. He was an outlaw hunted by the law and by Blackwood's men who now had a legal pretense to shoot him on sight. He moved like a phantom, sleeping in caves, his senses honed to a razor's edge. Jericho, his horse, was his only companion. The solitude was a heavy shroud, but it gave him time to think. He was stripped of his home, his name, his legacy, all built on a lie. In the stark clarity of the desert, he realized he wasn't just fighting Blackwood anymore. He was fighting the ghost of his father. Elena found him 2 days later. She rode out alone, risking everything to bring him supplies and a warning. He watched her approach from a high ridge, his hand on the Winchester, every instinct screaming that it was a trap. But he saw the genuine fear in her eyes as she searched the desolate landscape for him. He revealed himself stepping out from behind a cluster of boulders, his appearance as ragged as the terrain around him. "They're going to kill you," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she dismounted. "Silas has put a bounty on your head. He's told his men to bring you back dead, not alive." "Why are you here, Elena?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. "Because this has gone too far," she replied, her own voice filled with a mixture of anger and despair. "I came to help him reclaim our family's honor, not to watch him become a murderer. What your father did was wrong, Jedediah. But what Silas is doing, this isn't justice. It's a sickness." She explained that Blackwood was tightening his grip on the valley, using the fear of Cain the killer to force the remaining ranchers to sell. He was positioning himself as the town's savior, the man who would bring order by eliminating the threat he himself had created. Jedediah listened, his gaze fixed on the distant line of the horizon. He was trapped. If he stayed in the Badlands, Blackwood would win. If he went back to town, he'd be met by a noose or a bullet. "He has to be stopped," Jedediah said, more to himself than to her. "But I can't do it from out here." "Then let me help you." Elena offered, her eyes pleading. "I can get back into his office. He trusts me. There must be something there, a ledger, a letter, something that proves he hired the men who set the fire." It was a dangerous plan, one that would put her directly in the path of a man she now knew was ruthless. Jedediah hesitated, the instinct to protect her warring with the desperate need for an ally. But looking at her, seeing the resolve in her face, he knew she had already made her choice. This was her fight too. A fight to reclaim her family's name, not through vengeance, but through truth. "All right," he said, nodding slowly. "Find me proof, but you do it carefully. If he even suspects." I know she finished for him. I know what he's capable of. She gave him the bag of supplies, hardtack jerky, and a canteen of fresh water. As she turned to mount her horse, their eyes met. and in that shared glance, an understanding passed between them that went deeper than words. They were on opposite sides of a blood feud they hadn't started, two souls caught in a storm, set in motion by their fathers. And together, they would have to find a way to ride it out or be destroyed by it. She rode away a lone figure against the vast, empty landscape, leaving Jedediah to his solitude, a hunted man preparing for his final stand. The sky had turned the color of a fresh bruise, and the wind had begun to howl a low, mournful cry that promised violence. A sandstorm was coming. It was the perfect cover. Using the rising winds to mask his approach, Jedediah slipped back onto his own land, a ghost returning to his haunted home. The ranch house stood dark and silent, an empty shell waiting for the storm to break. He had sent word with Elena he would be waiting for Blackwood here at the heart of the land their families had bled for. It was a final desperate gamble. He didn't have to wait long. Through the thickening veil of dust, he saw them coming, Silas Blackwood and two of his men riding hard. But they weren't alone. Slumped over her saddle, her hands bound, was Elena. A cold, primal fury surged through Jedediah, so powerful it almost buckled his knees. Blackwood had found her out. He was using her as a shield, as bait. The confrontation he had planned, a showdown between two men, had just become a nightmare. They dismounted in the yard, and the wind whipping at their coats. Blackwood shoved Elena toward the house, one of his men holding a gun to her back. Cain Blackwood's voice was a triumphant roar, barely audible over the gale. "I know you're in there. Come out and face your legacy." Jedediah remained in the shadows of the dimly lit house, his Winchester steady. The front door creaked open, and Elena was pushed inside, stumbling into the main room. Blackwood followed, a cruel, satisfied smile playing on his lips. His eyes, burning with a fanatical light, scanned the darkness. "It ends here." Cain Blackwood said, his voice now calm, almost conversational. He was savoring his victory. "On the land your father stole from mine. Poetic, don't you think? Let her go." Blackwood Jedediah's voice came from the shadows near the hearth. "This is between you and me." Blackwood laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Oh, it's between all of us. You see, I believe in settling family debts. And there's one more detail of our shared history you seem to be missing." He stepped aside, pulling Elena into the faint light filtering through the dust-caked window. "Elena, my dear, why don't you tell Mr. Cain your full name?" Elena looked at Jedediah, her eyes filled with anguish and shame. "My name is Elena Blackwood," she whispered. "Silas is my brother." The words hit Jedediah like a physical blow. The secondary twist, the final brutal piece of the puzzle, slotted into place. Her conflict, her warnings, her betrayal of Silas, it had all been a lie. A manipulation. She had been working for her brother all along, playing on Jedediah's trust to get close to him, to learn his secrets, to lead him into this trap. She played her part beautifully, didn't she? Silas gloated, his hand gripping his sister's arm. "Fed you just enough hope to make you careless. Loyalty, you see, is a matter of perspective, and blood is always thicker than water." But as Jedediah looked at Elena's face, he saw more than just betrayal. He saw genuine terror. He saw the horror of a woman who had been part of a plan for justice, only to watch it curdle into something monstrous. Her deception had been real, but so had her change of heart. The sandstorm hit the house with full force, rattling the windows in their frames. The world outside dissolved into a swirling vortex of red dust and screaming wind. Inside, the only sounds were the ticking of the mantel clock and the storm's fury. This was the moment of truth, at the crossroads Silas had forced him to. He could give in to the rage, become the cold-blooded killer he once was, and kill them all. It would be easy. It would be satisfying. Or he could try to find another way, a way to end the cycle of violence his father had begun. Your father destroyed mine. Cain Silas hissed his composure, cracking the raw wound of his past exposed. He left him a broken man who died of shame. I will have my justice. He drew his pistol, aiming it, not at Jedediah, but at Elena. And it starts with cleansing my own family of weakness. In that instant, everything became clear for Jedediah. The battle was not for the land. It was for his soul. With a roar that was lost in the wind, he lunged from the shadows. He didn't fire his rifle. He threw it aside, choosing to fight not as a gunslinger, but as a man. He slammed into Silas, the impact sending them both crashing over a table. The pistol flew from Silas's hand, skittering across the floor. A brutal, desperate fight ensued. It was a clash of two legacies, a raw explosion of generational hatred played out in fists and fury. As they grappled on the floor, Elena Freed scrambled for the fallen pistol. One of Blackwood's men rushed her, but she was faster. She brought the heavy gun around, striking him hard across the temple. He crumpled to the ground. The other gunman, waiting outside, burst through the door, his rifle raised. A single shot rang out deafening in the enclosed space. But it wasn't from the gunman's rifle. It was from a Colt Peacemaker. Jedediah looked up to see Sheriff Thorne standing in the doorway, smoke curling from the barrel of his gun, the second henchman collapsing at his feet. Thorne, the man of defeat, had finally chosen a side. Jedediah landed a final desperate blow to Silas's jaw, stunning him. He pinned him to the floor, his hands closing around Silas's throat. He could feel the life pulsing beneath his fingers, could see the hatred and fear in his enemy's eyes. It would be so easy to squeeze to end it, to claim his own brand of justice. But then he saw his father's face in his mind, the thief, the swindler, and he saw the man he was about to become. He saw the cycle endless and bloody. With a shuddering gasp, he released his grip. The rage receded, leaving behind an aching emptiness. He had won, not by killing, but by refusing to kill. In the aftermath of the storm, a fragile quiet descended upon the ranch. The wind had died down, leaving a world blanketed in a fresh layer of red dust, as if the earth itself had bled and was now at peace. Silas Blackwood, defeated and broken, sat slumped against a wall, his wrists bound. Sheriff Thorne stood over him, his expression grim but resolute. He had found his courage in the chaos, and with it a renewed sense of duty. Jedediah watched as Thorne hauled Blackwood to his feet. There was no blaze of glory for Silas, no dramatic final words. Just the quiet, pathetic end to a lifelong obsession with revenge. He would be taken to the federal marshal in the next territory, where the testimony of Elena Thorne and the evidence of his crimes would ensure he never threatened the valley again. The cycle of violence had been broken, not with a bang, but with the click of handcuffs. After the sheriff and his prisoner had gone, Jedediah and Elena were left alone in the wreckage of the room. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with the ghosts of betrayal and the faint possibility of forgiveness. "I'm sorry, Jedediah." She began, her voice barely a whisper. "At first it was all for him, for my family. I believed we were righting a great wrong." Jedediah turned to face her, his body aching, his spirit weary. "And now I see that he was so consumed by my father's ruin that he became a ruin himself," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "He used our pain as an excuse to inflict it on others, and he used me. I thought I was helping him find justice, but I was just a tool for his revenge. When I tried to stop him, to warn you, he locked me up. He said I was a traitor to our name." Jedediah looked at her, truly looked at her and saw the profound and painful truth of her words. She was as much a victim of her family's legacy as he was of his. They were both trapped in a story written by their fathers. My father was a thief. Jedediah said, the admission costing him a piece of his soul, but liberating him as well. He stole this land. He stole your family's future. None of this would have happened if not for him. And none of it would have ended if not for you, Elena countered softly. You had every right to kill him, Jedediah. But you didn't. You chose mercy. That choice hung between them, a testament to the man he had become. The town slowly began to heal. With Blackwood gone, the fear that had paralyzed Redemption Creek dissipated like a morning fog. People started to talk again. The truth of the feud of Blackwood's manipulations and Jedediah's innocence in the arson came to light. The townspeople, ashamed of their fear and quick judgment, looked at Jedediah with a new respect. He was no longer the haunted recluse or the feared gunslinger. He was their protector. A few days later, Jedediah stood before the stone hearth in his now repaired house. He took his father's portrait, the one of the stern-faced hero, and carried it up to the attic. He didn't burn it or destroy it. He simply put it away, acknowledging the flawed, complicated man his father had been, and freeing himself from the shadow of the myth. The community, grateful and seeking to make amends, formally recognized his ownership of the land. They declared that it had been paid for not with his father's stolen money, but with Jedediah's own courage and restraint. He had earned his place not through inheritance, but through character. In a final symbolic act, Jedediah took the iconic six-shooter that had been his only companion for so many years, the symbol of his violent past, and walked to the highest ridge overlooking the valley. He dug a deep hole in the rocky soil and buried the gun. As he covered it with earth and stone, he felt the last heavy chain of his past fall away. He was no longer Jedediah Kane the gunslinger. He was just Jedediah Kane, a rancher, a man of peace. He returned to the house to find Elena waiting for him on the porch, a small travel bag at her feet. He had assumed she would leave, that the valley held too many painful memories. "I thought you'd be gone," he said, his heart sinking slightly. She looked out at the valley, now bathed in the warm, golden light of the setting sun. "I was going to," she admitted. "I was going to run from the Blackwood name, from everything that happened. But then I realized this land is my legacy too. Not the one of bitterness and revenge my brother wanted, but a new one. One I get to write myself." She turned to him, a tentative smile on her face. "If you'll have me, I'd like to stay. To help you build something new. Something based on truth." Jedediah looked at her, at the strength and resilience that shone in her eyes, and saw not the end of a painful chapter, but the beginning of a hopeful one. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers strong and steady. Together, they watched the sun dip below the horizon, free from the shadows of their past, ready to build a shared future.